John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was an English writer and philologist. He was the author of the high fantasy works The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. From 1925 to 1945, Tolkien was the Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon and a Fellow of Pembroke College, both at the University of Oxford. He then moved within the same university to become the Merton Professor of English Language and Literature and Fellow of Merton College, and held these positions from 1945 until his retirement in 1959. Tolkien was a close friend of C.S. Lewis, a CO member of the informal literary discussion group The Inklings. He was appointed a Commander of the Order of the British Empire by Queen Elizabeth II on March 28, 1972. After Tolkien's death, his son Christopher published a series of works based on his father's extensive notes and unpublished manuscripts, including the Silmarillion. These, together with The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, form a connected body of tales, poems, fictional histories, invented languages, and literary essays about a fantasy world called Arda and, within it, Middle-earth. Between 1951 and 1955, Tolkien applied the term legendarium to the larger part of these writings. While many other authors had published works of fantasy before Tolkien, the great success of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings led directly to a popular resurgence of the genre. This has caused him to be popularly identified as the father of modern fantasy literature or, more precisely, of high fantasy. Biography. Ancestry. Tolkien's immediate paternal ancestors were middle-class craftsmen who made and sold clocks, watches, and pianos in London and Birmingham. The Tolkien family originated in the East Prussian town of Kreuzberg near Königsberg, which had been founded during medieval German eastward expansion, where his earliest known paternal ancestor Michel Tolkien was born around 1620. Michel's son Christianus Tolkien was a wealthy miller in Kreuzberg. His son, Christian Tolkien, moved from Kreuzberg to nearby Danzig, and his two sons Daniel Gottlieb Tolkien and Johann Benjamin Tolkien emigrated to London in the 1770s and became the ancestors of the English family. The younger brother was J.R.R. Tolkien's second great-grandfather. In 1792, John Benjamin Tolkien and William Gravel took over the Eardley Norton manufacture in London, which from then on sold clocks and watches under the name Gravel and Tolkien. Daniel Gottlieb obtained British citizenship in 1794, but John Benjamin apparently never became a British citizen. Other German relatives also joined the two brothers in London. Several people with the surname Tolkien or similar spelling, some of them members of the same family as J.R.R. Tolkien, live in northern Germany, but most of them are descendants of people who evacuated East Prussia in 1945, at the end of World War II. According to Ryszard Dzierżinski, the Tolkien name is of Low Prussian origin and probably means son/descendant of Toke. Tolkien mistakenly believed his surname derived from the German word Tolkien, meaning foolhardy, and jokingly inserted himself as a cameo into the Notion Club papers under the literally translated name Rashbold. However, Dzierżinski has demonstrated this to be a false etymology. While J.R.R. Tolkien was aware of his family's German origin, his knowledge of the family's history was limited because he was early isolated from the family of his prematurely deceased father. Childhood. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was born on January 3, 1892 in Bloemfontein in the Orange Free State, to Arthur Reuel Tolkien, an English bank manager, and his wife Mabel, née Suffield. The couple had left England when Arthur was promoted to head the Bloemfontein office of the British Bank for which he worked. Tolkien had one sibling, his younger brother, Hilary Arthur Reuel Tolkien, who was born on February 17, 1894. As a child, Tolkien was bitten by a large baboon spider in the garden, an event some believe to have been later echoed in his stories, although he admitted no actual memory of the event and no special hatred of spiders as an adult. In an earlier incident from Tolkien's infancy, a young family servant took the baby to his homestead, returning him the next morning. When he was 3, he went to England with his mother and brother on what was intended to be a lengthy family visit. His father, however, died in South Africa of rheumatic fever before he could join them. This left the family without an income, so Tolkien's mother took him to live with her parents in King's Heath, Birmingham. Soon after, in 1896, they moved to Sarehole, then a Worcestershire village, later annexed to Birmingham. He enjoyed exploring Sarehole Mill and Moseley Bog and the Clent, Lickey, and Malvern Hills, which would later inspire scenes in his books, along with nearby towns and villages such as Bromsgrove, Alcester, and Alvechurch, and places such as his Aunt Jane's farm Bag End, the name of which he used in his fiction. Mabel Tolkien taught her 2 children at home. Ronald, as he was known in the family, was a keen pupil. She taught him a great deal of botany and awakened in him the enjoyment of the look and feel of plants. Young Tolkien liked to draw landscapes and trees, but his favorite lessons were those concerning languages, and his mother taught him the rudiments of Latin very early. Tolkien could read by the age of 4 and could write fluently soon afterwards. His mother allowed him to read many books. He disliked Treasure Island and The Pied Piper and thought Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll was amusing but disturbing. He liked stories about Red Indians and works of fantasy by George MacDonald. In addition, the fairy books of Andrew Lang were particularly important to him, and their influence is apparent in some of his later writings. Mabel Tolkien was received into the Roman Catholic Church in 1900 despite vehement protests by her Baptist family, which stopped all financial assistance to her. In 1904, when J.R.R. Tolkien was 12, his mother died of acute diabetes at Fern Cottage in Rednall, which she was renting. She was then about 34 years of age, about as old as a person with diabetes mellitus type 1 could survive without treatment. Insulin would not be discovered until 1921, 2 decades later. 9 years after her death, Tolkien wrote, "My own dear mother was a martyr indeed, and it is not to everybody that God grants so easy a way to his great gifts as he did to Hilary and myself, giving us a mother who killed herself with labor and trouble to ensure us keeping the faith." Before her death, Mabel Tolkien had assigned the guardianship of her sons to her close friend, Father Francis Xavier Morgan of the Birmingham Oratory, who was assigned to bring them up as good Catholics. In a 1965 letter to his son Michael, Tolkien recalled the influence of the man whom he always called Father Francis. He was an upper-class Welsh Spaniard Tory, and seemed to some just a pottering old gossip. He was and he was not. I first learned charity and forgiveness from him, and in the light of it pierced even the liberal darkness out of which I came, knowing more about Bloody Mary than the mother of Jesus, who was never mentioned except as an object of wicked worship by the Romanists. After his mother's death, Tolkien grew up in the Edgbaston area of Birmingham and attended King Edward's School, Birmingham, and later St. Philip's School. In 1903, he won a foundation scholarship and returned to King Edward's. Youth. While in his early teens, Tolkien had his first encounter with a constructed language, Animalic, an invention of his cousins, Mary and Marjorie Incledon. At that time, he was studying Latin and Anglo-Saxon. Their interest in Animalic soon died away, but Mary and others, including Tolkien himself, invented a new and more complex language called Nevbosh. The next constructed language he came to work with, Naf Aaron, would be his own creation. Tolkien learned Esperanto sometime before 1909. Around June 10, 1909 he composed the Book of the Foxrook, a 16-page notebook, where the earliest example of one of his invented alphabets appears. Short texts in this notebook are written in Esperanto. In 1911, while they were at King Edward's School, Tolkien and 3 friends, Rob Gilson, Geoffrey Back Smith, and Christopher Wiseman, formed a semi-secret society they called the TCBS. The initials stood for Tea Club and Barrovian Society, alluding to their fondness for drinking tea in Barrow's stores near the school and, secretly, in the school library. After leaving school, the members stayed in touch and, in December 1914, they held a council in London at Wiseman's home. For Tolkien, the result of this meeting was a strong dedication to writing poetry. In 1911, Tolkien went on a summer holiday in Switzerland, a trip that he recollects vividly in a 1968 letter, noting that Bilbo's journey across the Misty Mountains is directly based on his adventures as their party of 12 hiked from Interlaken to Lauterbrunnen and on to camp in the moraines beyond Mürren. 57 years later, Tolkien remembered his regret at leaving the view of the eternal snows of Jungfrau and Silberhorn, the Silvertine of my dreams. They went across the Kleinskide to Grindelwald and on across the Grosskide to Meiringen. They continued across the Grimsel Pass, through the Upper Valais to Brigg and on to the Aletsch Glacier and Zermatt. In October of the same year, Tolkien began studying at Exeter College, Oxford. He initially read classics but changed his course in 1913 to English language and literature, graduating in 1915 with first-class honours. Among his tutors at Oxford was Joseph Wright, whose primer of the Gothic language had inspired Tolkien as a schoolboy. Courtship and marriage. At the age of 16, Tolkien met Edith Mary Bratt, who was 3 years his senior, when he and his brother Hilary moved into the boarding house where she lived in Duchess Road, Edgbaston. According to Humphrey Carpenter, Edith and Ronald took to frequenting Birmingham tea shops, especially one which had a balcony overlooking the pavement. There they would sit and throw sugar lumps into the hats of passers-by, moving to the next table when the sugar bowl was empty. With two people of their personalities and in their position, romance was bound to flourish. Both were orphans in need of affection, and they found that they could give it to each other. During the summer of 1909, they decided that they were in love. His guardian, Father Morgan, considered it altogether unfortunate that his surrogate son was romantically involved with an older, Protestant woman. Tolkien wrote that the combined tensions contributed to his having muffed exams. Morgan prohibited him from meeting, talking to, or even corresponding with Edith until he was 21. Tolkien obeyed this prohibition to the letter, with one notable early exception, over which Father Morgan threatened to cut short his university career if he did not stop. On the evening of his 21st birthday, Tolkien wrote to Edith, who was living with family friend C.H. Jessup at Cheltenham. He declared that he had never ceased to love her, and asked her to marry him. Edith replied that she had already accepted the proposal of George Field, the brother of one of her closest school friends. But Edith said she had agreed to marry Field only because she felt on the shelf and had begun to doubt that Tolkien still cared for her. She explained that, because of Tolkien's letter, everything had changed. On January 8, 1913, Tolkien travelled by train to Cheltenham and was met on the platform by Edith. The two took a walk into the countryside, sat under a railway viaduct, and talked. By the end of the day, Edith had agreed to accept Tolkien's proposal. She wrote to Field and returned her engagement ring. Field was dreadfully upset at first, and the Field family was insulted and angry. Upon learning of Edith's new plans, Jessup wrote to her guardian, "I have nothing to say against Tolkien, he is a cultured gentleman, but his prospects are poor in the extreme, and when he will be in a position to marry I cannot imagine. Had he adopted a profession it would have been different." Following their engagement, Edith reluctantly announced that she was converting to Catholicism at Tolkien's insistence. Jessup, like many others of his age and class, strongly anti-Catholic, was infuriated, and he ordered Edith to find other lodgings. Edith Bratt and Ronald Tolkien were formally engaged at Birmingham in January 1913, and married at St. Mary Immaculate Catholic Church at Warwick, on March 22, 1916. In his 1941 letter to Michael, Tolkien expressed admiration for his wife's willingness to marry a man with no job, little money, and no prospects except the likelihood of being killed in the Great War. First World War. In August 1914, Britain entered the First World War. Tolkien's relatives were shocked when he elected not to volunteer immediately for the British Army. In a 1941 letter to his son Michael, Tolkien recalled, "In those days chaps joined up, or were scorned publicly. It was a nasty cleft to be in for a young man with too much imagination and little physical courage." Instead, Tolkien endured the obloquy, and entered a program by which he delayed enlistment until completing his degree. By the time he passed his finals in July 1915, Tolkien recalled that the hints were becoming outspoken from relatives. He was commissioned as a temporary second lieutenant in the Lancashire Fusiliers on July 15, 1915. He trained with the 13th Battalion on Cannock Chase, Rugeley Camp near to Rugeley, Staffordshire, for 11 months. In a letter to Edith, Tolkien complained, "Gentlemen are rare among the superiors, and even human beings rare indeed." Following their wedding, Lieutenant and Mrs. Tolkien took up lodgings near the training camp. On June 2, 1916, Tolkien received a telegram summoning him to Folkestone for posting to France. The Tolkiens spent the night before his departure in a room at the Plough and Harrow Hotel in Edgbaston, Birmingham. He later wrote, "Junior officers were being killed off, a dozen a minute. Parting from my wife then, it was like a death." France. Battle of the Somme. Home front. Academic and writing career. On November 3, 1920, Tolkien was demobilized and left the army, retaining his rank of lieutenant. His first civilian job after World War I was at the Oxford English Dictionary, where he worked mainly on the history and etymology of words of Germanic origin beginning with the letter W. In 1920, he took up a post as reader in English language at the University of Leeds, becoming the youngest member of the academic staff there. While at Leeds, he produced a Middle English vocabulary and a definitive edition of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight with E. V. Gordon. Both became academic standard works for several decades. He translated Sir Gawain, Pearl, and Sir Orfeo. In 1925, he returned to Oxford as Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon, with a fellowship at Pembroke College. In mid-1919, he began to tutor undergraduates privately, most importantly those of Lady Margaret Hall and St. Hugh's College, given that the women's colleges were in great need of good teachers in their early years, and Tolkien as a married professor was considered suitable. As a bachelor would not have been. During his time at Pembroke College, Tolkien wrote The Hobbit and the first 2 volumes of The Lord of the Rings, while living at 20 North Moor Road in North Oxford. He also published a philological essay in 1932 on the name Nodens, following Sir Mortimer Wheeler's unearthing of a Roman Asclepion at Lydney Park, Gloucestershire, in 1928. I Beowulf/I. None. Second World War. Family. The Tolkiens had 4 children: John Francis Reuel Tolkien, Michael Hilary Reuel Tolkien, Christopher John Reuel Tolkien and Priscilla Mary Ann Reuel Tolkien. Tolkien was very devoted to his children and sent them illustrated letters from Father Christmas when they were young. Retirement. During his life in retirement, from 1959 up to his death in 1973, Tolkien received steadily increasing public attention and literary fame. In 1961, his friend C.S. Lewis even nominated him for the Nobel Prize in Literature. The sales of his books were so profitable that he regretted that he had not chosen early retirement. In a 1972 letter, he deplored having become a cult figure, but admitted that even the nose of a very modest idol cannot remain entirely untickled by the sweet smell of incense. Fan attention became so intense that Tolkien had to take his phone number out of the public directory, and eventually he and Edith moved to Bournemouth, which was then a seaside resort patronized by the British upper middle class. Tolkien's status as a best-selling author gave them easy entry into polite society, but Tolkien deeply missed the company of his fellow Inklings. Edith, however, was overjoyed to step into the role of a society hostess, which had been the reason that Tolkien selected Bournemouth in the first place. The genuine and deep affection between Ronald and Edith was demonstrated by their care about the other's health, in details like wrapping presents, in the generous way he gave up his life at Oxford so she could retire to Bournemouth, and in her pride in his becoming a famous author. They were tied together, too, by love for their children and grandchildren. In his retirement, Tolkien was a consultant and translator for the Jerusalem Bible, published in 1966. He was initially assigned a larger portion to translate, but, due to other commitments, only managed to offer some criticisms of other contributors in a translation of the Book of Jonah. Final years. Edith died on November 29, 1971, at the age of 82. Ronald returned to Oxford, where Merton College gave him convenient rooms near the High Street. He missed Edith, but enjoyed being back in the city. Tolkien was made a Commander of the Order of the British Empire in the 1972 New Year Honours and received the insignia of the Order at Buckingham Palace on March 28, 1972. In the same year, Oxford University gave him an honorary doctorate of letters. He had the name Luthien engraved on Edith's tombstone at Wolvercote Cemetery, Oxford. When Tolkien died 21 months later on September 2, 1973 from a bleeding ulcer and chest infection, at the age of 81, he was buried in the same grave, with Burren added to his name. Tolkien's will was proven on December 20, 1973, with his estate valued at £190,577. Views. Religion. Tolkien's Catholicism was a significant factor in C.S. Lewis's conversion from atheism to Christianity, although Tolkien was dismayed that Lewis chose to join the Church of England. He once wrote to Rainer Onwin's daughter Camilla, who wished to know the purpose of life, that it was to increase according to our capacity our knowledge of God by all the means we have, and to be moved by it to praise and thanks. He had a special devotion to the Blessed Sacrament, writing to his son Michael that in the Blessed Sacrament, you will find romance, glory, honor, fidelity, and the true way of all your loves upon earth, and more than that. He accordingly encouraged frequent reception of Holy Communion, again writing to his son Michael that the only cure for sagging of fainting faith is communion. He believed the Catholic Church to be true most of all because of the pride of place and the honor in which it holds the Blessed Sacrament. In the last years of his life, Tolkien resisted the liturgical changes implemented after the Second Vatican Council, especially the use of English for the liturgy. He continued to make the responses in Latin, loudly, ignoring the rest of the congregation. Race. Tolkien's fantasy writings have often been accused of embodying outmoded attitudes to race. However, scholars have noted that he was influenced by Victorian attitudes to race and to a literary tradition of monsters, and that he was anti-racist both in peacetime and during the two world wars. With the late 19th century background of eugenics and a fear of moral decline, some critics saw the mention of race mixing in The Lord of the Rings as embodying scientific racism. Other commentators saw in Tolkien's orcs a reflection of wartime propaganda caricatures of the Japanese. Critics have noted, too, that the work embodies a moral geography, with good in the West, evil in the East. Against this, scholars have noted that Tolkien was outraged in peacetime by Nazi racial theory, while during the Second World War he was equally disgusted by anti-German racial propaganda. Other scholars have stated that Tolkien's Middle-earth is definitely polycultural and polylingual, and that attacks on Tolkien based on The Lord of the Rings often omit relevant evidence from the text. Nature. During most of his own life, conservationism was not yet on the political agenda, and Tolkien himself did not directly express conservationist views except in some private letters, in which he tells about his fondness for forests and sadness at tree felling. In later years, a number of authors of biographies or literary analyses of Tolkien conclude that during his writing of The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien gained increased interest in the value of wild and untamed nature, and in protecting what wild nature was left in the industrialized world. Writing. Influences. Tolkien's fantasy books on Middle-earth, especially The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, drew on a wide array of influences, including his philological interest in language, Christianity, mythology, archaeology, ancient and modern literature, and personal experience. His philological work centered on the study of Old English literature, especially Beowulf, and he acknowledged its importance to his writings. He was a gifted linguist, influenced by Germanic, Celtic, Finnish, and Greek language and mythology. Commentators have attempted to identify many literary and topological antecedents for characters, places, and events in Tolkien's writings. Some writers were important to him, including the arts and crafts polymath William Morris, and he undoubtedly made use of some real place names, such as Bag End, the name of his aunt's home. He acknowledged, too, John Buchan and H. Rider Haggard, authors of modern adventure stories that he enjoyed. The effects of some specific experiences have been identified. Tolkien's childhood in the English countryside, and its urbanization by the growth of Birmingham, influenced his creation of the Shire, while his personal experience of fighting in the trenches of the First World War affected his depiction of Mordor. Publications. I Beowulf/I, The Monsters and the Critics. None. On Fairy Stories. Children's books and other short works. I The Hobbit/I. None. I The Lord of the Rings/I. None. I The Silmarillion/I. None. I Unfinished Tales/I and I The History of Middle-earth/I. None. Works compiled by Christopher Tolkien. Manuscript locations. Before his death, Tolkien negotiated the sale of the manuscripts, drafts, proofs and other materials related to his then published works, including The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit and Farmer Giles of Ham, to the Department of Special Collections and University Archives at Marquette University's John P. Rayner, S.J., Library in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. After his death, his estate donated the papers containing Tolkien's Silmarillion mythology and his academic work to the Bodleian Library at Oxford University. The Bodleian Library held an exhibition of his work in 2018, including more than 60 items which had never been seen in public before. In 2009, a partial draft of Language and Human Nature, which Tolkien had begun co-writing with C.S. Lewis but had never completed, was discovered at the Bodleian Library. Languages and Philology. Linguistic career. Both Tolkien's academic career and his literary production are inseparable from his love of language and philology. He specialized in English philology at university and in 1915 graduated with Old Norse as his special subject. He worked on the Oxford English Dictionary from 1918 and is credited with having worked on a number of words starting with the letter W, including walrus, over which he struggled mightily. In 1920, he became reader in English language at the University of Leeds, where he claimed credit for raising the number of students of linguistics from 5 to 20. He gave courses in Old English heroic verse, history of English, various Old English and Middle English texts, Old and Middle English philology, introductory Germanic philology, Gothic, Old Icelandic, and medieval Welsh. When in 1925, Aged 33, Tolkien applied for the Rawlinson and Bosworth Professorship of Anglo-Saxon at Pembroke College, Oxford. He boasted that his students of Germanic philology in Leeds had even formed a Viking club. He also had a certain, if imperfect, knowledge of Finnish. Privately, Tolkien was attracted to things of racial and linguistic significance, and in his 1955 lecture English and Welsh, which is crucial to his understanding of race and language, he entertained notions of inherent linguistic predilections, which he termed the native language as opposed to the cradle tongue which a person first learns to speak. He considered the West Midlands dialect of Middle English to be his own native language, and, as he wrote to W. H. Auden in 1955, "I am a West Midlander by blood." Language construction. Parallel to Tolkien's professional work as a philologist, and sometimes overshadowing this work, to the effect that his academic output remained rather thin, was his affection for constructing languages. The most developed of these are Quenya and Sindarin, the etymological connection between which formed the core of much of Tolkien's legendarium. Language and grammar for Tolkien was a matter of aesthetics and euphony, and Quenya in particular was designed from phonesthetic considerations. It was intended as an Elven Latin, and was phonologically based on Latin, with ingredients from Finnish, Welsh, English, and Greek. An addition from late 1945 was Adunau or Numenorian, a language of a faintly Semitic flavor, connected with Tolkien's Atlantis legend, which by the Notion Club papers ties directly into his ideas about the inability of language to be inherited, and via the Second Age and the story of Eärendil was grounded in the legendarium, thereby providing a link of Tolkien's 20th century real primary world with the legendary past of his Middle-earth. Tolkien considered languages inseparable from the mythology associated with them, and he consequently took a dim view of auxiliary languages. In 1930 a Congress of Esperantists were told as much by him, in his lecture A Secret Vice, "Your language construction will breed a mythology," but by 1956 he had concluded that Volapük, Esperanto, Edo, Novial, NC, are dead, far deader than ancient unused languages, because their authors never invented any Esperanto legends. The popularity of Tolkien's books has had a small but lasting effect on the use of language in fantasy literature in particular, and even on mainstream dictionaries, which today commonly accept Tolkien's idiosyncratic spellings dwarves and dwarvish, which had been little used since the mid-19th century and earlier. He also coined the term eucatastrophe, though it remains mainly used in connection with his own work. Artwork. Tolkien learned to paint and draw as a child, and continued to do so all his adult life. From early in his writing career, the development of his stories was accompanied by drawings and paintings, especially of landscapes, and by maps of the lands in which the tales were set. He also produced pictures to accompany the stories told to his own children, including those later published in Mr. Bliss and Rove Random, and sent them elaborately illustrated letters purporting to come from Father Christmas. Although he regarded himself as an amateur, the publisher used the author's own cover art, his maps, and full-page illustrations for the early editions of The Hobbit. He prepared maps and illustrations for The Lord of the Rings, but the first edition contained only the maps, his calligraphy for the inscription on the One Ring, and his ink drawing of the Doors of Durin. Much of his artwork was collected and published in 1995 as a book, J.R.R. Tolkien, Artist and Illustrator. The book discusses Tolkien's paintings, drawings, and sketches, and reproduces approximately 200 examples of his work. Catherine McIlwain curated a major exhibition of Tolkien's artwork at the Bodleian Library. Tolkien, maker of Middle-earth, accompanied by a book of the same name that analyses Tolkien's achievement and illustrates the full range of the types of artwork that he created. Legacy. Influence. While many other authors had published works of fantasy before Tolkien, the great success of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings led directly to a popular resurgence in the shaping of the modern fantasy genre. This has caused Tolkien to be popularly identified as the father of modern fantasy literature or, more precisely, of high fantasy, as in the work of authors such as Ursula L. Le Guin in her Earthsea series. In 2008, The Times ranked him 6th on a list of the 50 greatest British writers since 1945. His influence has extended to music, including the Danish group the Tolkien Ensemble's setting of all the poetry in The Lord of the Rings to their vocal music, and to a broad range of games set in Middle-earth. Adaptations. In a 1951 letter to publisher Milton Waldman, Tolkien wrote about his intentions to create a body of more or less connected legend, of which he cycles should be linked to a majestic whole, and yet leave scope for other minds and hands, wielding paint and music and drama. The hands and minds of many artists have indeed been inspired by Tolkien's legends. Personally known to him were Pauline Baynes and Donald Swann. Queen Margrethe II of Denmark created illustrations to The Lord of the Rings in the early 1970s. She sent them to Tolkien, who was struck by the similarity they bore in style to his own drawings. Tolkien was not implacably opposed to the idea of a dramatic adaptation, however, and sold the film, stage, and merchandise rights of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings to United Artists in 1968. United Artists never made a film, although director John Boorman was planning a live-action film in the early 1970s. In 1976, the rights were sold to Tolkien Enterprises, a division of the Saul Zaentz Company, and the first film adaptation of The Lord of the Rings was released in 1978 as an animated rotoscoping film directed by Ralph Bakshi with screenplay by the fantasy writer Peter S. Beagle. It covered only the first half of the story of The Lord of the Rings. In 1977, an animated musical television film of The Hobbit was made by Rankin Bass, and in 1980, they produced the animated musical television film The Return of the King, which covered some of the portions of The Lord of the Rings that Bakshi was unable to complete. From 2001 to 2003, New Line Cinema released The Lord of the Rings as a trilogy of live-action films that were filmed in New Zealand and directed by Peter Jackson. The series was successful, performing extremely well commercially and winning numerous Oscars. From 2012 to 2014, Warner Brothers and New Line Cinema released The Hobbit, a series of 3 films based on The Hobbit, with Peter Jackson serving as executive producer, director, and co-writer. The first installment, The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey, was released in December 2012, the second, The Hobbit, The Desolation of Smaug, in December 2013, and the last installment, The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies, in December 2014. In 2017, Amazon acquired the global television rights to The Lord of the Rings, for a series of new stories set before the Fellowship of the Ring. Memorials. Tolkien and the characters and places from his works have become eponyms of many real-world objects. These include geographical features on Titan. Street names such as There and Back Again Lane, inspired by The Hobbit. Mountains such as Mount Shadowfax, Mount Gandalf, and Mount Aragorn in Canada. Companies such as Palantir Technologies. And species including the Waspscherplitus tolkieni, 37 new species of Elachista moths, and many fossils. Since 2003, the Tolkien Society has organized Tolkien Reading Day, which takes place on March 25 in schools around the world. In 2013, Pembroke College, Oxford University, established an annual lecture on fantasy literature in Tolkien's honor. In 2012, Tolkien was among the British cultural icons selected by artist Sir Peter Blake to appear in a new version of his most famous artwork, the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album cover, to celebrate the British cultural figures of his life that he most admired. A 2019 biographical film, Tolkien, focused on Tolkien's early life and war experiences. The Tolkien family and estate stated that they did not approve of, authorize or participate in the making of the film. Several blue plagues in England commemorate places associated with Tolkien, including for his childhood, his workplaces, and places he visited. Canonization process. On September 2, 2017, the Oxford Oratory, Tolkien's parish church during his time in Oxford, offered its first Mass for the intention of Tolkien's cause for beatification to be opened. A prayer was written for his cause. Notes. References. Primary.